My name is Corinne K. Weiner, and I am 32 years old. Buying my own house felt like finally exhaling after holding my breath for most of my adult life. It wasn't some sprawling mansion or picture-perfect show home, but it was solid bright and unmistakably mine. Every inch of it represented years of discipline, overtime hours, and choosing stability when it would have been easier to give in to exhaustion. I painted the walls myself on weekends, selected light fixtures with more care than most people reserve for relationships, and arranged the furniture until the rooms felt balanced, open, but protected. This house was supposed to be my safe place, proof that I had built something permanent without anyone's permission. That was why I decided to host a housewarming party. Not something loud or excessive, just an evening with people who had watched me struggle, grow, and finally land on my feet. Friends from work, a few college acquaintances who had stayed close, my father and my mother. When I invited my parents, I was very clear. I told my mother I wanted just her and my dad there. No Carson, no Vanessa. I didn't dress it up as a request. I stated it plainly, calmly, the way you do when you already know the answer might not be respected. My parents had been separated for almost 15 years. My mother remarried 2 years ago, and her new husband came with a 22-year-old daughter named Vanessa. From the beginning, Vanessa had a way of speaking that turned everything into a competition, even things that didn't involve her. Carson wasn't much better. He had a quiet arrogance, the kind that showed up in sideways glances and deliberate pauses, as if he was always evaluating whether you were worth the effort of politeness. I had tried early on to tolerate them for my mother's sake. It had never ended well. So I didn't want them in my home, not on the night that was meant to celebrate something I had achieved on my own. The party started exactly how I hoped it would. Music low enough for conversation, warm light, spilling from the windows, people laughing in small groups as they toured the house. I watched my friends' reactions with a quiet, private pride. This was what I had worked for. When my mother arrived, my stomach tightened immediately. Carson was beside her. Vanessa followed, already looking bored. For a moment, I considered saying something right there on the porch. I could have stopped it. I could have drawn the line publicly. But my mother smiled in that careful way she uses when she's bracing herself, and I knew whatever explanation she had prepared would come later. So I stepped aside and let them in. Vanessa walked through my living room like she was inspecting a rental. Her eyes dragged over the walls, the furniture, the floors. She didn't even try to hide it. Carson lingered near the doorway, arms crossed, surveying my guests instead of my home. My mother hovered between us, visibly tense, as if she were hoping proximity alone would smooth out years of friction. When I quietly asked her why they were here, she leaned in close, her voice low and urgent. She said she just wanted us to bond, that she wanted her family to feel like one unit. She told me how much it would mean to her if I could just try, just for one night. Her tone wasn't confrontational. It was pleading. And for a few seconds, I almost believed she thought this would help. So I let it go. I told myself I could survive a few hours. I smiled, offered drinks, and redirected conversations. I focused on the people who were genuinely happy for me. For a while, it worked. Then Vanessa started talking. At first, it was subtle. Comments about how the kitchen was cute for the size, a remark about how the backyard would be nice once you fixed it up. Each one was delivered with a laugh, like she was doing me a favor by pointing out my home's flaws. My friends exchanged looks. I pretended not to notice. But Vanessa didn't stop. She moved closer to a group of my coworkers and started comparing my house to places she claimed she could afford on her salary. She mentioned numbers casually exaggerating just enough to sound convincing if you didn't know better. I did know better. I knew she made about half of what I did. I also knew she still lived in her parents' basement. When she said loudly that she'd never settle for something so average, something in me snapped. I turned to her and smiled. The kind of smile that comes right before a truth lands hard. I told her she was more than welcome to buy her own place whenever she wanted, and that I was sure her parents would be thrilled to finally see her move out of their basement. The laughter around us wasn't cruel, but it was unmistakable. Vanessa's face flushed deep red. For a split second, she looked stunned, like no one had ever spoken to her that way before. I didn't linger on it. I simply turned away and rejoined my guests. I had hosting to do. The rest of the evening passed without further incident. Carson avoided me. Vanessa stayed quiet. My mother barely spoke, her smile tight and fragile. When the last guest left and the house finally went quiet, my mother didn't follow Carson and Vanessa out. She stayed behind, standing in the middle of my living room, as if she didn't quite know where to sit. That was when I told her the truth. I told her I didn't want her husband or his daughter in my life. I told her I was old enough to decide who I allowed around me and that they made me feel disrespected in my own home. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult anyone. I simply stated my boundaries. She didn't take it well. She told me I was being unfair, that Vanessa was young and just needed guidance. Then she said something that made my chest tighten. She said she wanted Vanessa to move in with me for a while. She framed it as temporary, convenient, almost logical. Her workplace was closer to my house. It would be good for us to spend time together. I shut that down immediately. I told her I couldn't tolerate Vanessa for a night, let alone share my space with her. This house was my refuge. I wasn't going to give that up. My mother argued. She pushed. She accused me of being selfish. I told her it wasn't going to happen. Eventually, she left angry and hurt, slamming the door harder than necessary. I stood alone in my living room long after she was gone, trying to convince myself that I had done the right thing. I had no idea that my refusal had just set something much worse into motion. I didn't sleep much that night. Even after the house went quiet, after I turned off the lights and locked every door, my mind kept replaying my mother's face as she stood in my living room. Hurt, defensive, and strangely distant, like she was already choosing sides. I kept telling myself that tomorrow would feel better, that this uneasy feeling was just the emotional hangover from confrontation. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. The next morning, I walked through my house, slowly, coffee mug, warming my hands, trying to ground myself in the ordinary. The sun came in through the kitchen windows just the way I'd imagined when I bought the place. This was still mine. I repeated that thought like a mantra as I wiped down counters and straightened cushions that didn't need straightening. By early afternoon, my phone rang. It was my mother. Her voice was softer than the night before, carefully measured, like she was afraid one wrong word would shatter whatever fragile truth she was hoping to rebuild. She didn't apologize for bringing Carson and Vanessa. Instead, she told me she'd been thinking all night and that she felt I'd been too harsh. She said Vanessa was sensitive, that she took things personally, and that my comment had humiliated her. I reminded her calmly that Vanessa had humiliated herself. There was a pause on the line, followed by a sigh that sounded rehearsed. My mother said I didn't understand how hard things were for her right now. She said blending families wasn't easy. She said she just wanted peace. Then almost seamlessly, she brought it up again. Vanessa moving in. This time she didn't ask. She talked about it like it was already halfway decided. She explained how inconvenient the commute was from their place, how stressed Vanessa had been at work, how this could be good for all of us. She kept repeating the same phrase over and over, just give her a chance. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I asked her when she had started planning this. She dodged the question. She said I was focusing on the wrong things. She said this was about family. I told her family didn't take over someone's home without consent. I told her I had bought this house to feel safe, not to become a solution to problems I hadn't created. I told her I wasn't responsible for Vanessa's housing situation. That was when her tone changed. She accused me of holding grudges. She said I was punishing her for remarrying. She implied that I was jealous of Vanessa, which hurt more than I expected. I reminded her that when I was Vanessa's age, I was working 2 jobs and paying rent without help. My mother brushed that aside, saying times were different, that I'd always been independent. Independent. The word landed heavy. It always did. It was the word she used whenever she wanted to excuse her absence. I told her no. Not now. Not ever. She went quiet, and in that silence I could almost hear her recalibrating. When she spoke again, her voice was flat. She said she was disappointed in me. She said she didn't raise me to be so inflexible. Then she said something that made my stomach twist. She said Carson felt disrespected in my home. That was the moment I realized this conversation wasn't really between my mother and me anymore. Carson was there, maybe not physically, but his influence was woven through every word she spoke. I told her I wasn't changing my mind. I told her I loved her, but this was my boundary. She ended the call abruptly. For the rest of the day, I felt on edge. Every noise outside made me look up. Every notification made my heart jump. I tried to distract myself with work, but my thoughts kept circling back to the same uncomfortable question. Why did it feel like I was being maneuvered into something? That night, I checked my locks twice before bed. I wish I could say I was surprised by what happened next. The notification came in just after noon the next day, right as I was halfway through answering an email at work. A sharp vibration against my desk, a small red banner on my phone screen. Security alert, unauthorized, entry detected. For a moment, I stared at it without understanding what I was seeing. like my brain refused to accept the meaning of the words. Then my chest tightened so fast it almost hurt. I left work without explaining much to anyone. I don't remember the drive home clearly, only the way my hands shook on the steering wheel and how every red light felt like an insult. I kept telling myself it had to be a mistake, a glitch, anything but what my instincts were already screaming. When I pulled up to my house, nothing looked wrong from the outside. The curtains were drawn. The porch light was off. For half a second, relief washed over me. Then I walked up to the front door and tried my key. It didn't turn. I tried again harder this time, panic creeping into my movements. Still nothing. That was when I noticed the lock itself. New, shiny, not the one I'd installed. My heart dropped into my stomach. I pressed my ear against the door and froze. There were voices inside. Furniture scraping lightly against the floor. Someone laughing. Someone else humming. I stepped back, my pulse roaring in my ears. I reached for my phone, already dialing in my head when the door swung open. Carson stood there like he'd been expecting me. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking the entrance with his body, his expression calm in a way that felt deeply wrong. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of my living room. My living room. Boxes stacked near the couch. Vanessa's shoes by the door. I asked him what the hell he thought he was doing. He smiled, not warmly, not kindly. It was the kind of smile meant to make you feel small. He told me I wasn't allowed inside, that this was my punishment. I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound that came out before I could stop it. I asked him what I was being punished for. He told me he wasn't going to explain it, that I should think about my behavior. Then, like he was doing me a favor, he reminded me of the party, of how I disrespected Vanessa in my own home. My hands clenched into fists. I told him to move. I told him I was calling the police. That was when his voice dropped. He told me I wouldn't do that. He said I cared too much about my mother to put her through something like that. He reminded me casually, deliberately, about her past with the police, about how much she hated them, about how unforgivable it would be if I involved them. He said Vanessa deserved this house more than I did. I felt sick, angry, trapped. He stepped back inside and shut the door in my face, the lock clicking loudly on the other side. I stood on my porch, staring at the wood grain, my reflection warped in the glass, realizing how calculated this was. They hadn't just taken my house. They had backed me into a corner where every option hurt someone. I stood there for a long time, weighing my mother's trauma against my own safety, my own autonomy, my own home. In the end, there was only one thing I could do. I called the police. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 officers, calm and methodical, asking questions, while I stood on my own lawn, feeling like a trespasser in my own life. My voice shook as I explained that I was the homeowner, that the locks had been changed without my consent, that people were inside my house who did not have permission to be there. Saying it out loud made it feel real in a way I wasn't ready for. When the officers knocked, Carson answered with the same smug composure he'd shown me earlier, as if he still believed this was a bluff that would dissolve the moment authority appeared. I watched from the driveway as the conversation unfolded. His posture stiffened. His voice lost its edge. Vanessa appeared behind him, arms crossed. Her expression unreadable. She didn't look scared. If anything, she looked irritated, like the evening had been inconvenienced. The officers were firm. Ownership records were verified. The situation was clear. Carson tried to argue that this was a family matter, that things had been misunderstood, that he was only trying to teach me a lesson. The words sounded absurd even as he said them. Vanessa protested loudly when she was told to pack her things, claiming she'd already started settling in. One of the officers gestured to the open boxes near the couch, and the finality of it all seemed to hit Carson at once. He looked at me, then truly looked at me like he was trying to understand how I dared to go through with it. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He'd counted on my silence, on my guilt, on my mother. When they were escorted out, Carson kept shaking his head, muttering under his breath. Vanessa didn't say a word. She just stared at me with a strange, almost detached calm that unsettled me more than anger would have. The officers waited until they were gone before handing my keys back to me. One of them suggested I change the locks again immediately. I locked the door behind me and slid down against it, my knees giving out. The house felt wrong now, violated. I sat there long enough for the adrenaline to drain, leaving behind only exhaustion and a heavy sense of dread. Because I knew what came next. My phone rang less than an hour later. It was my mother. She didn't yell, she didn't accuse. Her voice was quiet, trembling in a way I'd never heard before. She told me she couldn't believe I'd done something so cruel. She said I should have called her first. She said I had embarrassed her. Then she said the words that hurt the most. She said she couldn't forgive me. I tried to explain. I told her they'd locked me out. I told her I had no choice. I reminded her that this was my home. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she told me she was disappointed in me. Not angry, disappointed. She said involving the police was something she could never get past. I apologized, even though every part of me screamed that I shouldn't have to. I told her I was sorry for hurting her, for triggering her trauma, for putting her in this position. She didn't respond. She ended the call and blocked me. I stared at my phone long after the screen went dark, feeling like I'd just lost something I didn't know how to replace. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. My phone stayed face down on the kitchen table for hours, like it might burn me if I looked at it too long. I kept expecting another call, another message, something that would soften what she'd said. Nothing came. By nightfall, the reality settled in. My mother had chosen distance, and she'd done it decisively. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't really want and sat on the floor of my bedroom with my back against the bed. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel comforting anymore. Every room carried the echo of what had happened. The front door especially felt like a wound that hadn't closed yet. I replayed Carson's words over and over in my head. How easily he'd used my mother's past as leverage. How confident he'd been that I wouldn't dare cross that line. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this hadn't been impulsive. The lock change, the timing, the way my mother had pushed so hard for Vanessa to move in, it all fit together too neatly. I didn't want to believe they'd planned it, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that I'd been steered into an impossible choice on purpose. The next morning, a friend sent me a screenshot. It was from Vanessa's social media, a photo of her. Carson and my mother on a beach, all of them wearing sunglasses and smiling into the sun. The caption read, "Just a fam recovering." I stared at the image longer than I should have. Recovering from what? Losing access to my house, being asked to leave a place that was never theirs. The word felt like a slap. What hurt more was my mother's expression. She looked relaxed, happy, the kind of happy I couldn't remember seeing when it was just the two of us. I called my father after that. He listened quietly as I told him everything, his voice steady in contrast to the mess in my chest. When I finished, he said something that made my stomach drop. He told me my mother had spoken to him weeks before the housewarming party. She'd asked if he knew of any affordable places Vanessa could live near her job. He'd told her he couldn't help unless she was planning to buy something. According to him, she'd said she would if it were up to her. But Carson didn't want to spend that kind of money on a temporary situation. Temporary. The word felt hollow now. What hurt the most wasn't just the manipulation. It was the comparison. When I was Vanessa's age, my mother had refused to help with my college tuition. She'd told me I needed to learn independence. She'd said struggle would make me stronger. And I had believed her. I'd built my life around that belief. But now watching her bend herself into shapes she'd never bent for me, it felt like I'd been raised on a different set of rules. I thought about vacations too. How I'd always wanted to go to the beach, and how she'd always said she hated it. How we'd compromised, meaning I'd compromised, until I stopped asking. And now there she was, smiling on a beach with Vanessa. It dawned on me then, slowly and painfully, that Vanessa had the version of my mother I'd never known. The patient one, the generous one, the one who showed up. I didn't know if my mother realized what she was doing, or if she was simply choosing the path that required the least resistance. Either way, the result was the same. By that evening, I knew I couldn't let things end like this. Not with silence. I needed to hear it from her directly, even if it broke me. I asked a friend to let me know when Vanessa was back from the trip. When I found out they'd returned, I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone in my hand, heart pounding. She hadn't blocked my number. I didn't know if that meant anything, but I knew if I didn't call her now, I might never find the courage to do it at all. I sat there for almost 10 minutes before I finally pressed call. My thumb hovered over the screen, shaking as if my body understood the risk before my mind fully caught up to it. I told myself I was doing this for clarity, not reconciliation. I wasn't calling to beg. I was calling because I needed to say the things I'd carried for too long. She answered on the third ring. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear movement on her end, the faint clink of dishes, the sound of a life continuing without me in it. Finally, I told her I needed to talk. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I told her I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. She listened. She really did. I spoke for nearly half an hour, my words tumbling out in a rush I couldn't slow down. I told her how it felt to watch her protect Vanessa in ways she never protected me, how it felt to be asked to be understanding my entire life while no one seemed willing to understand me. I told her that I loved her, but that loving her had always felt like an exercise in shrinking myself. When I finally stopped, she said she wanted to meet in person. We met for lunch the next day at a small cafe halfway between our neighborhood's neutral ground. When she walked in, we hugged. It felt familiar and strange at the same time, like muscle memory without the emotion attached. We ordered food we barely touched. Then we talked. I told her everything. Not just about Carson and Vanessa, but about my childhood. About being told I was strong when what I really was unattended. About being independent because there was no alternative. About how I didn't need her to be perfect. I just needed her to try. She cried quietly while I spoke. When it was her turn, she didn't deny any of it. She told me she hadn't been ready to be a mother when she had me. She told me she'd felt trapped by expectations, by marriage, by responsibility. When she finally got divorced, she wanted freedom, and she took it without considering the cost. She admitted that she'd checked out emotionally long before the paperwork was signed. She said that now she finally felt ready to have a family, that she was trying to do it right this time. I waited for her to say with you. She didn't. Instead, she told me she thought it would be best if we took some time apart, that we were both going through a lot. That distance might help us heal. I understood what she meant, even if she didn't say it out loud. Carson and Vanessa didn't want me close, and she was choosing the path of least conflict again. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I paid the bill and hugged her goodbye. The drive home felt unreal, like I was watching myself from somewhere outside my body. It hurt in a quiet, final way. Not explosive, not dramatic, just heavy. I realized then that this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about accepting that my mother might never be the person I needed her to be. When I got home, I poured another glass of wine and stood in the middle of my living room. The house felt like mine again. Not because it was safe from intruders, but because I understood what it was now. A place where I didn't have to wait for anyone's permission to exist.